Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Big Bros Podcast, episode 24 today. My name is Jeremy, and again, I'm joined by my lovely friend and co-host, Ilan. How are you, mate?
Mate, I'm fantastic. But who else are we joined by?
We are joined today by a remarkable guest with a remarkable story. Bradley, welcome to the show, mate. Great to have you on.
Thanks so much for having me, guys. It's a pleasure and always nice to sit down, have a yarn to new people, to hear new stories, and looking forward to sharing mine with you guys tonight.
Mate, it's an absolute pleasure. And we spoke a bit just before the camera got rolling of how we got to know you and some of your work. And you have a podcast yourself called A Lot to Talk About. And there's a lot of things that you kind of touch on, very similar things that we touch on, which is the whole idea of sharing, being vulnerable, whole idea of masculinity as well, and kind of how you've tied that into your own personal journey. So for us, we wanted to kind of get someone who is as like-minded as yourself to come on.
No, it's a pleasure to be here, and I think it's a beautiful medium, podcasting, because we live in a world where everything that we consume is quite short, and our attention spans are smaller than ever. You know, like I sit in front of TikTok or Instagram and I scroll, and I'm not even quite sure that I'm consuming the information that's in front of me because there is so much of it and it's so rapid and quick fire. And I find, though, that when I sit down and I listen to a podcast, it's really a beautiful connection with how stories should be. Like, it's long form, it's honest, it's natural, it's raw. And for me, that's the thing that I fell in love with when I started the show. It was a connection to an old friend, which was storytelling, like this old passion that I'd loved for my whole life. And it was the most accessible opportunity to do that on a consistent basis, but not only to do that with people whose paths I would never cross in everyday life. So, you know, I love this medium, and I love podcasting as a vehicle for storytelling. And yeah, I'm just looking forward to getting into it with you lads here tonight.
100%, could not agree more. And I think that's the beauty of podcasting as well. Like we only reached out, a few weeks ago, basically did not know each other. It's our first time meeting, and we already feel like it's, we've known each other forever essentially. So it's just that beauty of podcasting allows like-minded people to connect and talk about things that, they're passionate about talking about. So that's what we really admire about you and your show as well. And why we're so excited to get stuck into this. So welcome, mate. It's great to be here and great to have you on. Now tell everyone a brief synopsis. I say brief, but I know we're going to be fleshing it out in some full depth. But tell us who you are. Tell us what makes Bradley the bloke he is.
That's a great question. I guess, well, I touched on it a little bit before. If someone said to me, who are you and what describes you the best or the most accurately, I'd say a storyteller. And I think that's been the case for my whole life. It's fair to say that I love a yarn. I love a chat. I love to not only share the stories that are unfolding within my own life, but rather to connect with and share stories of, like you said, like-minded people, or people who maybe are completely different to me and share different perspectives. I think there's something really powerful and interesting about that. I'm 27. I live here in Wollongong, Australia, and I guess these are all these tags that we put on ourselves as our careers, our age, our demographic, where we live, what we do, as who we are. But essentially, I think at the surface, that's who I am. And at the core, I'm just a guy who really wants to fuel the adventure of my life. And I think, excuse me, I've always had this feeling or this sense of urgency that for me, I wanted a life that was less ordinary. I wanted a life that got me out of bed in the morning with a smile on my face and a little spring in my step, and knowing that I was doing something that was different, something that challenged me, something that gave me a sense of meaning and purpose. And essentially that fuel has been a part of my life from the moment I come into this world, because I knew that my life was always going to be different. I was born with cystic fibrosis, and the challenges and the hurdles that put in front of me from the first moment, that I come into this world, meant that life was going to be different for me. I was going to learn lessons that were different to the average lessons that kids would learn in their early years. I was going to have a different perspective on life, what life was about, how precious it was, and what I wanted to do with the time that I had. So I would say that I'm a different cat, but that's what I love about myself,
Mate, great synopsis. I remember listening kind of few weeks ago when you were on Dylan Friends, and you mentioned on the potty that when you were 3 weeks old and you went to the doctor and the doctor said he's got cystic fibrosis to your parents, he pretty much also said at the same time, it's better to almost have a terminally ill child. And a lot of that sort of thing is quite heavy to drop on your parents, and also just the things you're told when you're younger. You're told from a young age that your life is limited, that what your opportunities are quite limited relative to everyone else. When you were younger, how did you find that you started to kind of deal with those things? Because I look at you now and I think, wow, you've got an incredibly resilient mindset. And that doesn't come overnight. That comes from years and years of kind of personal and mental development.
Yeah, it's a great question because, it's funny when I think about my cystic fibrosis, it is so much a part of who I am and the way that I've lived my life and the way that my mindset has been crafted, that it's weird to think of life or a world in which I exist without it. And, I don't say that I can imagine there's plenty of people who will come across this with CF because I do a lot of stuff in that space. And I don't think that patients or people who are living with CF or people who are close to someone living with CF should take that as though your life is defined by this condition, but rather who you are and who you become is a byproduct of the challenges and the resilience that's required to live with it. It was actually a little after 3 weeks that my parents had that doctor's appointment. I was diagnosed at 3 weeks. And for them, that information, receiving the diagnosis, being told that their first son, who they'd done absolutely everything to make sure I would be healthy coming into the world, had this condition that they really didn't know a whole lot about, it really rocked their world. Like, it flipped things upside down, and they had to learn and really gather themselves on the go as they found out what this condition meant for my life and for the rest of their lives. Because, to be parents is a big decision because there is so much responsibility that comes with it. But to be the parents of a child with cystic fibrosis at a time where we didn't really have the medication that we do now, and we didn't have the physiotherapy or the health practices that we do now, was just such a challenge. And so that meant for them like hours a day of hands-on physio to clear the mucus off my lungs. It meant that every time I had breast milk, I had to have digestive enzymes to make sure that I absorbed the nutrients and that I could actually grow. And I remember my mum's always proud of, as any good mum does, they like to feed us and they like to make sure that, we grow into big, strong boys. And my mum remembers that they said, you'll never keep this kid, above the 50th growth percentile. And I think I was up around like the 90th growth percentile. And she's just been ever so proud of that. You know what I mean? Even now at 27.
Just a yoked baby, hey?
Yeah, 100% a yoked baby. And, I look back at those years and I think about those challenges and that word, or those words that doctor said to my parents. And it's had such an impact on my life. It's defined my life in the best way, because I think that to grow, I've seen this great thing today from Alex Hormozy, one of my mates, Foon, sent it to me, and it was saying that, to grow a muscle, you have to tear it and put it under, real challenge and test. And, you have to tear it and tear it and tear it. And little by little, as you tear it and you break it down, it starts to build back up. And he said, it's like the same with your mind and the same with your soul, that little by little, it's torn down by the adversity that we face in life. But little by little, you make the choice to build it back up so that you're stronger and you're better than you were before. And I was just given these ultimate tests at such a young age, in which there was no way, shape or form that I would survive or be where I am without developing a real sense of resilience and mental grit and fortitude that has allowed me to go and do things, I think now at this stage in my life, that I would consider less ordinary. And so, cystic fibrosis has had the biggest impact on me, and I'm so grateful for it. Like, what a blessing. What a blessing that I was dealt a hand that required me to really test myself and to dig deep and to grow. And so without it, I don't know that I'd be the man that I am today. And, I'm not all that interested in a reality in which I don't have cystic fibrosis.
I bloody love that, mate. I absolutely love that, because one of the key themes that we like to talk about on the show is not having that victim mindset. So, absolutely owning the cards you're being dealt and not thinking, why me? Anyone could have sat there and said, why me? Why did it have to be me that was dealt these cards? But I feel like hearing that, and from such a young age, you were able to take it in your stride and say, this is just me. It's just something that I have, just like everything else that other people have in the world. And I'm just going to crack on and get the most out of life, just like anyone else can. But what is inspiring for me is hearing how resilient you were at such a young age. Because like when I think of resilience, especially with my life, and I think Ilan can speak for himself, it's something that I've probably only really tried to delve deep into in my later teen years. But this is something that's been instilled in you at such a young age. So I think, I'm sure you've got an incredible family, incredible parents around you, but I'm just so intrigued as to, what were the steps taken, or, how did you develop such a mature, resilient mindset at such a young age?
I think it's so unconscious, like I remember being really observant as a kid. Like I was always watching what other people were doing and watching how my parents acted and watching how the people around me acted in certain situations in which we found ourselves. Yeah, I remember being so observant whenever I was at the hospital at Sydney Children's, and I'd go into, there was almost like 3 steps to every clinic appointment. I'd go in, they'd check my weight and height. And I remember I'd jump on the scales and I'd go put my back against the wall, and you always just stretch that little bit higher, make sure your spine's as straight as it could be, because you want to make it look like you're growing rapidly and you want to feel good about the results that you get. And I remember the nurse would call out my weight and my height, and I'd look straight to my mum and dad, and I'd look at the expression on their face, and they were smiling. And then we'd go and we'd sit in the weight room, and then my CF doctor would call me in, and we'd go into the room, and I'd sit there. And he was such a positive guy. His name was Dr. John Morton, and he was the doctor they found that shared the same positive hope and view for my life as they did. After that very cruel doctor was thrown to the side very early on. And I remember I'd walk into Dr. Morton's office, and the first thing he'd say, he always wore a bow tie, always just a white shirt with a fancy bow tie, no suit jacket. He always had his hair slicked back, and he always had a smile on his face. And the first thing he'd say to me every time I walked into the room was not, how's your CF been, or talk to me about your health. It was always, how many medals have you won this month, my boy? Because he knew I was an athlete, right? So I had this positive view, and I'd tell him, and then I'd look at my parents and they were smiling. So I'd go into those, like then that physio appointment, and the physio appointment would be to test my lung function. And so there's 2 measures in which they test lung function. The first is the capacity of air that you can get into the lungs. And then the second is like how quickly you can get that capacity out, or actually I should say how much of the capacity you can get out in the first second of breathing it out. So you do like this exercise where you'd breathe really deep, and then you try to push it all out as quick as you could.
That's the one.
And I remember every time I do that, that was a really good sign of where my lungs were at, right? And I always had really good numbers as a kid. And I remember as soon as I finished and they read out my results, I would be so competitive about it. But I'd look straight to my parents to see whether they were smiling or whether they looked concerned. And so when you talk about building mental resilience, and I talk about it being almost unconscious, it was almost a byproduct of how my parents responded to everything. Because I would look to them, because as a kid, when you're dealing with this thing that you can't fully grasp and understand, it's a part of your world, your life, your reality. It's a part of who you're going to be for the rest of time. That first impression on how you should respond to it is by how the people around you are responding. Like, it's so environmental. And I remember looking at my parents every time, and to see the smile on their face always just told me all I needed to know, that it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay if they think it's going to be okay. And so as a byproduct of that, I had just the most confidence and self-belief that this thing was never going to hold me back, limit, or define my life. And then on the other hand of the spectrum, the thing that was very conscious was that, I was told at a really early age that I wasn't supposed to be able to athletically perform because I was going to have a reduced lung function. I wasn't going to grow properly as, a normal kid who didn't have CF would. And so I was going to be slower and smaller and weaker. But that wasn't my reality, because I was faster, I was stronger, I was fitter than all of my peers. And my mates hate when I say that, but they know it's true, right? And so, when I'm winning state champion 100 and 200 meter sprints as a kid, and, I'm playing footy competitively, and like I'm a good young athlete, I was like, well, this thing isn't holding me back. In fact, it's actually a badge of honor because I'm not supposed to be able to do any of these things, but yet here I am achieving them. So why would I
100%.
feel any less about myself? And then there's a third one that I'll add, which I give so much credit to me being the way that I am and me having, I guess, more the personal self-esteem and confidence as, someone who was different, because you got to realize that I went to school, right? And from a very early age, I took 30 tablets a day, up to 50 tablets a day some days. And so when I was like 5 and I'm going to school for the first time, I'm the only kid who's sitting in the schoolyard eating their lunch but taking tablets to do it. I'm the only kid who has to do puffers and nebulizers when he gets home. I'm the only kid who has to go to the doctors every 8 weeks and, is noticeably out of class. And so for a lot of people with CF, they really struggle with that, right? Because it's a clear marker that they're different to their peers. But I had a little sister, I still do, who's 2.5 years younger than I am. Her name's Shania. We call her Sissy. And she just looked up to me as a kid, right? And so she was just like the light of my life. Just like when she come into the world, it was just like the greatest gift I could have ever been given, because it was just like a best friend, a sister, someone who looked up to me, who, I could take care of and look after all in one. And I remember every morning we'd sit up at the brekkie bar and mum and dad would make us brekkie. And we come from one of those fun families that, we're allowed to have Fruit Loops and Cocoa Pops and all that jazz for brekkie. And I remember sitting up every morning having my cereal or my apricot jam toast, and I would have to take my tablets, right? And I would take a bunch of tablets. I'd take digestive enzymes to digest my nutrition. I would take some tablets for, my vitamin levels, for my lungs, for my liver, for my gut. And as I take those tablets in the morning, my sister was so upset because she couldn't take tablets like me. And so she used to have these like little strawberry and orange chewy vitamins that she could have. So she took her tablets alongside me. And I remember as a kid just looking at my sister and going, well, she wants to be like me, so why wouldn't anyone else? Like, why would I be ashamed of these things if she looks up to me? And so for me, it was just like these three things, looking at my parents, noticing the way that they were always positive and reacted well, noticing that consciously I was able to athletically perform and do things that I shouldn't be able to do with CF, and then having a sister who looked up to me. It gave me all the confidence in the world that, I have this thing, and it's going to provide me with challenges, but I should be proud of the fact that I'm here overcoming them. And maybe it's the hindsight that I have now to look back on all of that and understand it a little clearer. But it definitely had such an impact on my life. And so I never was upset about the fact that I had CF. And I never felt discouraged by it, because why should I?
Mate, that's fantastic. And look, it just goes to show the power of familial support, of having your parents by us and your sister, and even like a good, supportive health practitioner who, didn't want to ask you about your CF, but rather about all the other things that were going on in your life, like your achievements. So I think that's really, really strong and powerful. When you were around, let's say like 16, 17, 18, these are the ages where, you start going to parties, you start drinking, you start doing a little bit more of those risque things. And, as someone who was and is living with CF, how did that in a way influence what you could and couldn't do in those kind of milestone years?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think that part of our life is so forming, right? Like, especially socially, and from a level of insecurity or, confidence, confidence levels can be challenged and tested during those times. And, when I was 9, I was diagnosed with liver disease. So I knew that I'd never drink. So I was told from a very early age that drinking for me was going to be basically toxic, and like my liver wouldn't be able to handle it. So I knew that I'd never drink when I got to 18. So I guess it's like, for example, if you told me that I couldn't eat chocolate for the rest of my life, I'd go, fuck, that's challenge. Like, that's tough, because I love a bit of chocolate, but I'd never touched a drink. I'd never had alcohol. And, if you can't tell, I love a yarn. Like, I wasn't socially challenged. So I feel like alcohol wasn't going to be a social lubricant that was necessary or needed. And so for me, the idea of not being able to drink didn't really bother me. It also saved me a lot of money, and it made my life easier when mates were trying to get drinks to go to parties and, trying to find ways to cheat the system. I didn't have to worry about it. Like, it wasn't a bother for me. The other thing was, a lot of people at that age are starting to try recreational drugs and test the waters there. And For me, I took 30 to 50 tablets a day already. So why would I take one that could be a detriment to my health?
That's right.
Like I just wasn't interested. I also had a dad who was a copper. So I respected the fact that, you know, like it would just disappoint my parents incredibly if I did go down that route. And, you know, but I think when you fought so hard for your health at that point in your life, and especially at 18, my health started to challenge me in some ways. Like I think I'd become a little bit complacent and rested on my laurels that I didn't need to be super proactive in my fight against CF because I'd been so well up until the age of about 17 that when I started to have some challenges at 18 and I started to notice that, well, my lungs are actually starting to provide me with some challenges. And I had my first lung bleed at 18 and my first real scary infection at 18. And I remember thinking, this is something I really need to cherish. So what I found was more so a challenge for me, and this isn't even CF related, but when I got to like 14, 15, I started to get like, you know, most people start to get like some pimples and bad skin when they're in their teens. I didn't get like consistent acne, but I would get really bad cystic acne. And if anyone's seen or had cystic acne, it's crushing because there's no way you can hide it. Like if you've got a boil on the side of your face the size of like your phone, it's pretty hard to like cover it up or hide it or make out that it's not a pimple and it's just a scratch. And I remember getting like a cyst for the first time and it crushes your confidence. Like literally any self-esteem or confidence or like any little bit of belief you have in the fact that your mum's told you the most handsome man in the world up until that point is just crushed to the point that you get cystic acne.
Mate, I can 100% agree. I've had those experiences too. I took days off school. Even at uni, I copped a few. It's crushing.
It's crushing. And so I remember the first time I broke out really bad with a cyst. It was right between my eyes. The worst spot, right? So you're like, literally someone's looking at me in the eyes when they're talking to me. And the whole time, you know, they're thinking, what is that? Like, what's the third eye that you've just grown? Like, what is going on there? And so I was just like, how do I cover this? So I remember going to school, putting a Band-Aid over it and just telling people that I'd like cut in between my eyes playing footy or something like that, like sliding across the dirt the day before. And so like it got a little bit infected and I had to cover it up. And I remember just how much that crushed me. But I think, you know, at the time I used to think it wasn't a big deal. Like, yes, it's embarrassing and it's not ideal, you know, and it's not great for the looks. And I used to do the wrong thing. Like I'd pick it and I'd, you know, like try to slice it with a little needle or a blade to get rid of it. And like, it just damaged my skin.
It leaves the worst scarring as well.
It leaves bad scarring. And like, I used to get a lot of them around sort of like where I used to have dimples. So I don't even feel like I've got dimples anymore. I feel like I didn't realize how much it crushed me until I realized that I started to retreat a little bit when I had this stuff. Like I was such an outgoing, bubbly personality at school. Like I always had to be the center of attention or had to be like the class clown or the guy who was funny and making a scene and like doing something to get people's attention. But I found that like I started to retreat a little bit and I wouldn't really go out on the weekend or I'd miss this event or I would kind of make myself not seen at school. And I found that really started to crush me. So the thing that I was really challenged with when I hit that really pivotal age is I started to question whether I was going to be valuable in a relationship setting. And what happened with that insecurity that was formed that I'm not valuable enough or I'm not worthy enough to be in a relationship. I'm not what girls would want because I don't have good skin. Then I also started to compile that and just to compound insecurities on top of one another, right? So it was like one was the opening of the floodgates. And then this thing that did creep in with my CF was, well, you know, how on earth would anyone find me an acceptable partner when, you know, I've got all these hopes and dreams and I don't believe in the limitations that CF is supposed to enforce on my life. But when a potential partner searches cystic fibrosis on Google, they're going to see that I've got a life expectancy of 36 to 41. And they're going to see that, you know, without IVF, I can't have kids. And they're going to see that there's all these challenges and potential roadblocks to me being a good partner, or maybe not even a good partner, but a partner that can stick around for the rest of their life because maybe mine is going to be short, they think. And so that's something that I'll never have.
Mm.
And so I just built this incredible insecurity and this roadblock in my mind that wasn't something meant for me. And so the real challenge for me was I just found myself self-sabotaging in any opportunity to form those sort of romantic relationships. And I started to close myself off to the idea that it was possible for me. And it really wasn't until, nearly 9 months ago now, I met my partner, Soph, that all of that changed. And it was really instigated by a mate of mine, Foons, who comes on my podcast consistently every month. And over a coffee one day, and I'm skipping well ahead here. I know you asked me about the period of 16 or 18, but
Mate, anything's on the cards.
I love it. We had gone for a run one morning and he said, why don't we go have a coffee next week? And we'll sit down at coffee. And he said, I want you to bring up 2 limiting beliefs that you see in me as my best mate. And I want to bring up 2 that I see in you. And let's do it in a way that is safe and feels supportive. But I feel like we could help each other overcome some stuff that's challenging in our lives. And I love the idea because I'm always up for that kind of thing. So I said, yeah, bloody oath. And so this one morning we went for a run. We jumped in the water as we do. And we went and we had a coffee at Lee and Me, our local cafe. And as we're sitting there and, I've addressed 2 limiting beliefs that I see in him, it was his turn to shoot at me. And the first thing he said is...
Did he rate him?
Really well, really well.
Good.
And that's, I have to say, I'm just a sidebar here. I'm very blessed. I've got an incredibly tight friend circle of mates who are just all in on being super supportive, all in on like helping each other get the most out of our lives and overcome the shit that is challenging, right? Because we all face those very relatable challenges in our 20s. And it was his turn to serve. And the thing he said to me just straight away that hit me between the eyes and knocked my socks off was, he said, it baffles me how you can get on stage or sit behind the mic on a podcast and the badge of honor, the thing that makes you so valuable is you've got this story of overcoming the odds of your cystic fibrosis, and it's your superpower because for all of the challenges and adversity it's dealt you, like you've overcome it and you're here where you are and you run marathons with bleeding lungs and you're this guy that everyone talks about when you get on stage and behind a mic. But when it comes to finding someone to spend the rest of your life with, it's the thing that you think is going to hold you back from ever finding that. Fuck. And I was like, whoa, he's hit the nail on the head here. Yeah. Because it was so true. And so, if I believe it's a badge of honor, why can't I allow that to cross context and serve as a badge of honor in the way that I find myself in a relationship, to show that my commitment, my resilience, my ability to face adversity and come through the other side is actually incredible traits that would serve any relationship really well. To know that the same way that my family, my friends and I all believe that my future will be limitless and not defined by CF, to believe that there's a partner out there who would think the same thing. And so he really planted this seed in me, this seed of hope and this seed to really believe that was meant for me. And, with that sort of encouragement, it doesn't happen overnight, but you start to open yourself to the idea of it. And I think I'm so blessed that he had that conversation with me at that point in my life, because it made me very aware of not wanting to self-sabotage. And so when I met Soph, it just put me in the perfect opportunity to capitalize on, spending the rest of my life with someone I love.
Do you reckon that the reason it kind of hit you as it did was in one way, it was almost like subtly saying you're being hypocritical, because you're saying on one hand that your CF hasn't held you back and you can do all these amazing things, but on the other hand, you're using it almost as a crutch to say, like, there's no point of me even seeking a long-term partner because who would want me with what I come with?
We spoke about it just before, right? The victim mindset. It doesn't serve you. And I was the last person to claim victim when it come to overcoming the odds of my illness. I was the last person to put my hand up and say, I'm a victim when my lungs were bleeding and I had a marathon to run a week later. But when it comes to relationships,
that's another story, isn't it?
biggest victim, like, oh, it's just not possible for me. And so it was so hypocritical and it was so limiting. And it was just so, to be honest, it was so negative and pessimistic of me. And so it's funny, right? Like, we can all preach and, I'm the guy that whenever I get on stage, people go, God, you're positive. God, you just exude positive energy. But I'm still human, you know, and so
100%.
in so many areas of my life, you know, I allowed that to get the better of me without even being fully conscious of it at
Yeah.
times, you know, and so for me, it's the greatest thing, you know, I've said over the course of my journey, right? Like I've been doing the podcasting for 3.5 years and sharing with different people. And I remember I used to say that, you know, one of the greatest gifts I was ever given was my family. And
Mm.
that's still true. You know, I used to say that one of the greatest gifts and blessings I was ever given was my cystic fibrosis. And that's still true. But I mean it when I say that the greatest gift that ever come into my life was my partner, Soph. There's nothing like, and it gets me kind of emotional. Like I can feel the tear
Go on,
ducts
go on.
starting to exercise here. But there is nothing like finding someone who it's unexplainable. You can't describe the feeling, who, you know, wholeheartedly believes in who you are and what you're destined to do, and will ride with you through all of the shit and all of the challenges and all of the adversity, and is there beside you with a smile on her face. And it's just it's a connection and a bond that you can't describe. And I'm so lucky that I found the love of my life, and I never thought I would find it. You know, I never thought I'd be a dad. I used to think I was going to have to do the Cristiano Ronaldo thing and just father a child by myself and turn him into a D1 athlete. You know, and I joke about that, but in the most serious way, to be able to look at the future and go that I know I'm going to be a dad. I know that I'm going to raise kids. I know that I'm going to have a wife that I love, someone that I can build a life with, who has given more meaning and joy and fulfillment to everything that I do in my life. Like I loved podcasting and speaking. I love it so much more now that I get to jump off the mic after I'm done with you boys tonight and go sit in bed with a cup of tea and talk to Soph about it. The fact that I get to jump on stage and look to the crowd and I know she's there with a smile on her face or with tears in her eyes. Like that for me is the most meaningful thing. And, you know, I think I believe wholeheartedly that you have to learn to be happy and find meaning in your life alone. But I don't think you should underestimate the happiness and the extra meaning and fulfillment you get when you find that person you want to create life with. And that's a
100%.
special feeling.
Oh, I love that so much, mate. And making me emotional hearing that, seriously. But one thing I wanted to touch on there is, you know, a big theme that all of us like to talk about is, you know, self-love, self-worth. You know, if no one else is going to be your cheerleader, you need to be your biggest cheerleader. But I think there's so much merit in acknowledging that it is so important to get that acknowledgement from those around you, those loved ones around you. And that's why I think it's, especially as guys, like we should, you know, be more open in telling our mates how much we love them, how much they mean to us, because hearing it from someone else really just instills that self-love even more so.
Yeah, I mean, you could have the most amount of self-love and self-respect. And look, I've got mates as well who they don't show much emotion. You tell them that you love them, they'll be like, thanks, mate. But you know, and you know exactly who I'm talking about. There are people you know on a deeper level, they love it. And no matter, and that's kind of my point, is that it doesn't matter how much like self-respect and love you've got, hearing it from someone else who's close and dear to you still has the same impact.
If not greater. If it kind of reaffirms it, doesn't it?
It does. It's just magnified when it comes from someone who you see that into. And, you know, for me, it's also the meaning and the purpose of life, I think, is, and I think we all share a similar purpose in the sense that it's our job to show up authentically in the world and to love the people around us and create life for the people around us. And then we all have our own individual purpose that we pile on top of that too. But I know that my life is so much richer for having Soph in it. And, you know, family has now a bigger meaning because my family used to refer to the people who brought me into the world, the people who have been there alongside me for the whole lot of it. But now I think family is not only what you're born into, but rather the people that you bring into it and the people that you create more family with. And for me, I think connection is just an undervalued part of the human experience. And that's what we're here to do, is to continue to create connection and to foster connection and to really nurture connection, you know. And that's what the podcast is about, connection,
That's why
right?
we're
Like
here, hey?
that's life.
That's it.
I mean, also like the whole thing you mentioned just before, like you can't wait to be a dad. It just gives you another purpose in life. Albeit I don't have kids, I'm not married yet, but it's something that, you know, before that happens, it's hard to find purpose in life. You know, people can go their entire lives without finding what they want to do and how they want to impact the world. But as soon as they become a parent, mother or father, you have the purpose right there. It's undeniable. You may not want it, but the purpose is there, and you feel that kind of, you know, I've heard it from my parents, I've heard it from grandparents. You have this kind of obligation, but it's not an obligation in like a negative way, but you have a meaningful obligation. And I think that's why I think I resonate so much with what you just said before, because beyond that connection, you do have that duty.
I think it's the greatest purpose in the world to be a parent. You know, I look at my two parents, and without them, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be healthy enough to do what I'm doing. I most certainly wouldn't have had the opportunities that I've had. And I look at them, and it was their positivity and their courage that allowed me to stay here, to be around, to live life, to do what I do now. Like without them, there's none of this. You know, and I think you said there about the meaning that you get out of looking after people and bringing up children. I think that when I think about purpose and meaning, what's so powerful about it is that purpose fuels progress, and purpose fuels progress even when adversity exists in that place. And I think you look at the adversity of being a parent, all of the hardship and all of the challenges and all of the things that would make you want to quit and give up on that. But you look at those children and you know that because of you, they'll go on to be their own little humans and to live lives that you're then going to be proud of. And I think the beautiful thing about purpose and meaning, and why I think so many people should understand the power of it and actually develop some purpose and meaning for their life, is that adversity is a given. Like we all have adversity. We are all going to face adversity in multiple areas of our life at multiple times. And often that adversity is so challenging that you feel like it's breaking you and you feel like it's beating you down and that it's something that you can't overcome. But the beauty of purpose and meaning is that with it, you find a way to overcome adversity and to be stronger on the other side of it. And so I think parenting, or being parents and bringing children into the world, is arguably one of the greatest purposes someone can ever have. And so for me, I know that my life will only be richer when that time comes.
Mate, you're going to be the best dad. You're going to be the best dad. I think just aside from being a dad, being a parent, just a great mentor for anyone younger or even older in your age. And I just think, you know, the fact that you wear that with a badge of honor, you wear everything you do with a badge of honor is so inspiring for so many people who, you know, might be going through the same thing, might not be going through the same thing. But I'm just wondering, have you come across fellow kids who are going through CF as well, and you know have heard your story, and they're wearing it as a badge of honor like you do too? Because I'm sure there are plenty of kids that, you know, would have heard your story and are wearing it with a badge of honor, and that would probably give you that much more gratitude and happiness as well.
I'm glad you asked that question, because you've just recounted for me a couple of really nice memories that'll be fun to recall on here. And I guess for me, it all started, right? So growing up with CF, because my parents were so positive, I wasn't really involved in or exposed to the community of CF patients at large. There's 3,500 to 4,000 people in Australia with CF. And really until the last couple of years, when we had some life-changing drugs hit the market, a lot of those stories were quite sad and upsetting stories. They were stories of people who lost their lives too young, who, you know, I think 50% of people didn't make it past the age of 27 for a good portion of time with CF. When I was born, it was referred to as the childhood's disease because people didn't make it out of their teen years. And so there were just a lot of negative and sad stories. And my parents never wanted to expose me to that because they didn't want me to be influenced by that. They didn't want me to feel negatively or to feel uninspired or limited by my CF. And so I didn't really hear much of other people with CF. We knew one or two families who my parents would speak to their parents, but not really, you know. And So really for me, my first exposure to this community at large was in 2020 when, I'd been experiencing a lot of bleeds in my lungs and, as I always did, finding myself bouncing back and just being mentally resilient. There was one particular night I'd had 3 nights of bleeding in the lungs, and it was a July winter evening, and I'd just quit my job a couple of months before, and I was starting to look after my health again and starting to actually put some action to getting my health back on track. And so for the last 4 Sundays before this evening, I'd been starting to run and starting to try to get a little bit fitter and get my lungs back in shape. And on this night, it was about 2 a.m. It was a Wednesday evening, and I was lying in hospital. My dad was beside me in the emergency room, and we're waiting for some tests to come back. And so whenever you have a bleed in the lungs, if you bleed enough, they do a bunch of blood tests to see whether you've lost too much blood, whether you need a blood transfusion, whether they do some x-rays to see whether they need to go down and actually repair something. And so we're lying in hospital, and I'd stabilized at this point, but we're waiting for those results. My dad and I were sitting there, and he asked me sort of how I was feeling about the situation. And I remember just saying that I felt really positive, that I started to actually develop a passion for running, which sounded crazy because I fucking hated long distance running, up until this point. And it was so challenging, and I couldn't understand why people wanted to run long distances. I just thought it was so silly. But I said, I'm starting to love this running thing, and I feel really positive about the fact that I can get my health back on track. And I said, but you know what? I just feel like right now it's my time to not just do this for me, but to do something for the CF community at large. And what actually inspired that idea was a memory had popped up on my phone. And it was a memory of my dad 24 years ago that was sitting in my camera roll. And it was like a black and white photo from the paper of him crossing the finish line of a charity run that him and my mum had organised for CF. So my dad and my uncle Tezel, alongside a couple of marathon runners, ran 68 Ks 3 days in a row for CF. And so there was a photo of him running across the finish line with a can of Tui's in his hand and shortest footy shorts on.
Oh,
and
legendary.
I was just laughing at that photo, and it inspired me. And I said, you know what, Dad, it's July now. I'm going to get myself out of this hospital bed. By the end of the year, I'm going to run a marathon for CF to prove for people with CF that no matter how hard it gets and no matter how challenging it is, nothing's impossible. And my dad just said, if you want to do it, you'll make it happen. And so I got out of hospital that next morning. I went home and I started recovering. And it was about a week later, I announced on social media, to make it very official, that I was going to run a marathon at the end of the year. I called it 42 for CF, being 42.2 Ks. And I said, maybe we'll raise some money, but more so I just want to prove that nothing's impossible for people who are living with this condition, that you shouldn't be limited or defined by this, but rather you should be inspired to take life into your own hands. And so what happened over the course of the next week was, for me, life-changing. It was the start of my voice growing some real weight and some real power in the CF community. And Cystic Fibrosis Australia, who are the foundational body for CF in Australia, got behind me and said they were going to endorse the event and create a fundraiser. Wow. Then Wollongong Council approved it as the first official marathon in Wollongong's history. And all of a sudden, I had a coach on board who was going to train me for free, who was going to come and run it with me. I had 13 mates who would put their hands up to say, let's all do it with you. And all of a sudden we had a crew. And so I started really training and putting in the work to get there. And so I went from a place in which I struggled to run 5Ks to being able to run 25Ks in 6 weeks. And over the course of the weeks that followed, I started to get fitter and fitter. And I had some hiccups and some hurdles where the first 4 weeks, my lungs bled after every long run. And I had to take tablets to stop it and go to the hospital sometimes. And then a month out, I had a really bad bleed, probably the scariest bleed I've ever had, where I couldn't stop it. And my bathroom was just covered with blood, looked like a battle scene from Gladiator. I was waiting for Russell Crowe to pop out. And I was just I was really scared. I thought, it's never been this bad. I can't get it to stop. And I ended up back in hospital. And I remember being told by the doctor, he come into the room and he said, mate, talk to me, what's going on? And I said, mate, I don't know. I've got really bad bleed in my lungs. but I got a marathon to run in a month and it's your job to get me to the start line. I'll do the rest.
Oh,
And I remember running the marathon on the 12th of December, 2020. And it was the hardest thing I'd ever done up until that point in my life. Like, it took every little bit of air I had in my lungs. It took every stride from my legs. And it just took every ounce of resilience I'd built over the course of a lifetime fighting CF. I was just a couple of weeks before crossing that finish line, I was in hospital with the worst bleed in my lungs. I wasn't able to train properly the last couple of weeks. And when I crossed the finish line, I remember thinking about that doctor 24 years ago who had said that my life was ruined, that I'd be better off with a terminal illness that would kill me or I'd get over. And I remember just saying, fucking look at me now. And like, for me, that was my message to the CF community, that you never let anyone tell you what you can't do. Never let anyone tell you what your life's supposed to look like. Because yeah, some things are unpredictable and not every outcome is certain in life. But if you believe that you're destined to do great things, like, I believe that what you believe is what you become. And I believe that if you then take that belief and couple it with action, you're giving yourself the best chance of having really positive outcomes. And so for me, there was a real statement where I got to share that with the CF community in Australia, and it connected me with so many good people. And it was very inspiring to hear from a lot of the families at that time, but it was particularly the second year when we got sorted for that event. We're going to do it again. And it was 2 weeks out from the event, I got really sick. My lungs started bleeding again, and I ended up back in hospital in the emergency room. And I remember they said to me, we need to put you on some really heavy IV antibiotics, and they're going to finish just before your marathon. And they were like, we don't think you should run the marathon. And I was like, well, I'm going to run the marathon, so why don't you put me on the antibiotics? And thank God I get off just beforehand. And so it was the next morning, and I went to the hospital, and they had to put a PICC line into my arm. So a PICC line is like a cannula, but instead of it just going into the vein in your arm or in your hand, they go up sort of into your bicep, and they find a central vein that goes up and connects and goes into the top of the heart. So you can pump more drugs into the body, and you can pump it around quicker. And so they put this PICC line in, and the line sits within the vein of your arm, and then you're connected 24/7 to IV antibiotics. And they said you can do it from home. And whilst I was lying there and the doctor was feeding the line through my arm and they're ultrasounding it to make sure it goes into your heart, my phone started ringing. And I was pretty chill, so I was like, I'll answer it. And I answered it, and it was a producer from Sunrise. And he said, hey, mate, your mum messaged me on Instagram. She told me what you're doing in a couple of weeks. Would you like to come up and speak to Sam Mack, the weatherman, for a live cross? And they'll tell you a story on Sunrise. And I was like, I'd love to, because Sunrise gets nearly 1 million viewers every morning. And so I was like, yeah, I'm up for that. And he was like, you're going to be fine to do it tomorrow. And I'm looking at this lady feeding a thing into my arm. And I'm like, yeah, I'll be right. And so I went up there the next day. I still remember it was the 22nd of September in 2021. And I got up there and I had an IV drip stuffed into my pocket, a line in my arm. And I was on air with Sam Mack for about 3.5 minutes, just talking about my marathons and my story. And I remember when I left, I just had all of these messages because, Sunrise at that time in the morning, all the mums and dads who were at home with their kids,
100%.
getting the kids ready for school are watching this thing. And so I had so many messages. And there was this 2 messages in particular that just, for me, said it all. One was this lady, she was a mum, and she said her daughter was 3 and she's got CF. And she was sitting up having her wheat bix with condensed milk because they're always trying to fatten us up as CF kids to give us plenty of energy. And she said, you popped on the screen, she heard CF, and she sprinted from her wheat bix to the screen, grabbed the side of the TV and just watched you. And she said all day, she just mentioned Brad. And for me, I was just like, and she said, I'm so excited that my daughter has someone to look up to who has what she has and has faced the same challenges that she will face. Like, for her, you're going to be such an inspiration. And then there was one little boy, and his mum messaged me about a week later. He was 6 years of age. I can't remember his name, but he loved his running. And she said, he watched you on Sunrise last week. And at the end of the marathon, it showed a video of me running across the finish line with no shirt on. And then like with, you know, with my tattoos and all that. And she said every night that he's gone for a run this week, he refuses to wear a shirt. And I was like, how cool is that? That these little kids who potentially would have seen all of this negativity, and potentially their parents have been given no reason at this point in their life to be hopeful for the future that they may have, that they can see me, and hopefully in the darkness of what can be such a challenging condition, I'm just that little bit of light at the end of the tunnel, that reason just to keep going when things are tough, when there's so much adversity, when CF looks like it's winning, just to know that little chance, that guy who's running marathons with bleeding lungs, who's able to overcome the odds of this condition, if I'm just that little bit of hope, well, then I've done my job. And so for me, it's been the biggest blessing. It's something I never thought I would do, because I never knew that I'd be this involved in the CF community, but something I'm so glad it's happened, because, you know, I hope that there's plenty of little kids that now have bright plans and big plans for their future.
I mean, if you didn't have purpose before, you definitely do now, because, you know, getting those text messages from mums worried about their children and, you know, worried that they're going to kind of develop that negative line of thinking, because that's all you're told when you're diagnosed with CF is just the negative stuff. And seeing you know, training, running that marathon would have been huge. But, you know, as you said, we're all human as well. And there are going to be times where you get that lingering voice of doubt in your head. Surely when you were in those hospital rooms, you're getting plugged up with the IV or the medication you were on, were there any times where you're like, you know, I've done enough, but, you know, it's probably not smart for my health to run this marathon? Like, you know, I've raised enough awareness. I've done enough things. Like, surely I've given myself some sort of insurance to be like, I shouldn't go a step further because that could potentially kill me.
Yeah, I think there would be some logic there, but it's hard to explain. I think I don't think I've ever doubted myself when it's come to being able to run the marathons. And don't get me wrong, like my second one, when I had, you know, just a few weeks after that Sunrise interview, was bloody tough. Like my body was really flogged. Like I felt it. I remember getting to 30 Ks. I remember getting to 15 Ks, I'll say, and I knew that I wasn't feeling good. Like my heart rate was very high and my lungs felt quite stressed and my energy was quite low. And when I got to 30, like I was so cold, it felt like I was in the snow with no shirt on. And I was wrapped in a jumper, shivering on the floor. My body was cramping up. My lungs were coughing. And I remember being so disappointed that I had to finish walking a bunch of it, and like just being so disappointed because I didn't want people to see me hurt. I didn't want these kids to feel as though, you know, that it was tough, that it was this challenging, but it felt so real and it felt so honest. And I think when I look back, I think it was really important I had that experience, and I'm really glad that I had this really challenging experience after the first one, which was a far more effective and faster run, because I think it's really metaphorical of life, right? That you've reached the top of the mountain and just on one given day, something can challenge you and it knocks you straight down to the bottom again. And life is about accepting that we have to keep climbing. We have to keep getting back up and moving forward. And, you know, it's such a cliche, but it's so true. Like those cliches are true and they ring true for a reason, because, you know, life is consistently challenging. But I'd say the one thing that has been the most challenging for me over the course of the last couple of years in particular, it's really hard for me to accept anything that feels quite average.
Yeah.
You know, and I mean this in the most respectful way, that I truly believe that I've been put on this planet to do something different, like to do something that really helps a whole lot of people. I just don't think that, you know, and whether you believe in the universe or whether you're religious or whether you believe in fate or destiny or whatever it is, I'm not quite sure what I believe in. But I do know that I believe that I've got a purpose that is to uplift and inspire hope in others, particularly through my story. And, you know, saying this to my partner, Soph, today, I'm an emotional cat, right? Like I get very emotional when it comes to the topic of life. And at lunchtime today, my partner Soph come by. I'd been in the office this morning, and at the moment I'm working a Monday to Friday job to keep my head above water. and it's not particularly what I love or what I'm passionate about, but it's something that allows me to keep doing what I love, which is the speaking and the podcasting.
Sure.
And she come by at lunchtime to see me, and she just drove by in the car, and I jumped in and we were sitting there, and I'd seen this clip pop up just before, and it was from a movie. I'm not quite sure what movie it was, but it was George Clooney, and it was, you know, the guy who's runs the newspaper in Spider-Man, the first Spider-Man. I don't know what the actor's name is.
Spider-Man.
Yeah. But it's him much older, and he's sitting there, and I'm assuming that the context of the clip is he's being fired from his job. George Clooney's firing him.
Right.
And as he's sitting there, George Clooney says to him, I'm going to read it to you because I've literally got it in my journal, which sits beside my computer. He says to him that basically when he read through his file, he's seen that he studied food. He studied to be a chef. And he said, when most people took that degree and went and got a job at KFC, you started waiting tables at this particular fancy restaurant because you wanted to be around that environment of excellence. But then he said, but then at one point in time, you were offered a job here. And he said, how much did they first pay you to give up on your dreams? And the guy responds with 27 grand. And then he said, you know, I see guys like you who work at the same company for their entire lives. They clock in, they clock out, and they never have a moment of happiness. And he said, you have the opportunity here, and it's a rebirth. And I think he's basically firing him to go and do what he's meant to do.
Yeah.
And I just paused that clip and I locked my phone, and I get emotional. It's going to get me here. The one thing that, yeah, I was an emotional cat. The one thing that
Beautiful,
I'm really
mate.
blessed for is I've got a very supportive group of people. And over the last 3.5 years, I've sacrificed, getting so emotional here. I've sacrificed a lot to be here, right? And my dad in particular has been someone who's been there watching it all. Like I lived with him until the start of this year when they moved north, and Soph and I started renting this off them, this place. And my dad's watched me like start my first podcast, have all the chats, put in all the work. And he called me last week and he was asking me how, like I speak to him every day, but he was asking me on this one particular day how I felt about the job. And I was like, mate, it's tough because like I know what I love and I know what I want to do. And I'm like, I feel like I'm so close, you know, like I can smell it. And he said to me, he said, promise me you won't give up on your dreams. And I was like, fuck. I said, yeah, I promise. And I think today I seen that cliff and I'm like, can't give up on your dreams.
Nah, it's that rebirth.
Yeah, it's that rebirth. So that's me just getting really emotional. But I think I got in the car with Soph today and I just said, and I was a bit emotional. I was like, fuck. I can smell it. I just got to keep moving forward. And I've got to keep putting one foot in front of the other, keep hammering forward because I'm like, I truly believe that this is what I'm destined to do, you know?
I believe it
to
too,
help
mate.
people. So
I believe it wholeheartedly.
That's my cry for the day.
Mate, thank you so much for sharing that. That's beautiful. That's hit me as well. And yeah, I can't resonate enough with that. And I'm sure Elon's the same because sometimes the passion might not take you to where you want to be straight away, right? And I think we're all feeling that. And we need to be realistic as well and think, fuck, like we do need to keep our head above water at times.
But you know
too,
you know what fucks with me though is I don't know who I heard it from, but I heard somewhere whether it was a quote, but a lot of people don't succeed because they're scared to succeed. They're scared for the potential of everything going right. Because as you said, you know, it's on one hand you've got the safety and security of things.
Yeah. But sometimes I think we also need that fire under our ass to actually, you know, get ourselves out there and chase that passion even more so. But it's that funny tango between the two, isn't it? But mate, I fully believe that, you know, you're destined for greatness, and you're already providing that much greatness. And, you know, I think those messages of inspiration that you got from those mums on Sunrise, those marathons you did, crossing over those finish lines, even the times where, you know, you might have been in the hospital bed, but you've gotten out of the hospital bed. You know, not every win is always a massive win. You've got those, you know, massive small wins too. And every step of that way is just getting you closer towards that end goal. And we call it an end goal, but I think it's something that won't necessarily have an end, because it's a passion and you're going to be doing it forever, mate. So keep watering that grass, mate, and it's only going to get greener.
For sure. And you know what I think it is, lads? I think one of the greatest quotes I've ever heard is a Confucius quote, and it's, every man lives two lives. The second begins when he realizes he has just one. And like, I had that realization. Unreal, right? And I had that realization at 18 when I had my first ever lung bleed, and I was heading to the hospital, flying through traffic with my dad driving the car, and you know, and I thought I was dying, because I'd been told at this point in time that if that ever happens, you get to emergency as a matter of life or death. And I remember sitting in the car, and it's almost like time freezes to a standstill, and I'm just like really conscious about everything that's unfolding in front of me. And I remember thinking about my family and the fact that I wanted more time with them. I remember thinking about like how scared I was that this could be the end. But I remember just thinking at the time that I'm 18 and I've got so much life left to live. I hope I get a chance to do that. You know, I hope I get a chance to do something that is truly meaningful. And I don't mean to sound stuck up or to sound privileged, because I recognize that I'm very blessed to do what I love. But I'm very blessed that I've found that at this point in my life, at a very young age, that I found an opportunity to do that. And I can see it. I can see what it looks like for me, and I'm so close. But I think when you've had an experience like that, when you've had a life realization, you've contemplated whether you're going to get to take another breath after that moment, it is very hard to go and live a life that you just turn up and exist in.
Yeah.
Like, you know, I think I've seen a thing that most people die at 25 and get buried at 70. And I'm like, that's not how I'm going to live my life. You know, I'm too conscious of the fact that this is such a blessing. I'm too conscious of the fact that I've gone through so much to be here that I can't let that opportunity to do something of real meaning slip. And, you know, I mentioned Gladiator before, when I had that moment coughing up blood in my bathroom, and there's a Gladiator quote tattooed on my leg, and it's, what we do in life echoes in eternity. And that for me is the goal. That's the purpose, the mission. I leave a legacy. Exactly.
Mate, that's beautiful. I think that's bloody awesome. I'm lost for words.
I'll be honest with you. I think the last 10, 15 minutes, I don't know what to respond. You've left us speechless, because, you know, I think something you do really well is when you speak and you share it, in a way, it invites us to kind of think about our own thoughts and feelings
and reflect.
Because I've said it to Jeremy so many times where, you know, I would love to get to a position where, for example, you know, I'm practicing my career out of wanting to do it, not out of obligation. I would love for the podcast to become something that I could do full time alongside Jeremy. And he said the same thing. And, you know, just hearing what you said there, really, the only way for it to happen is you need to go all in.
Yeah.
You have to go all in. That doesn't mean that you can't support yourself with a side gig or a side job or anything like that, because you have to do what you have to do. As you said, it's allowing you to do what you love to do. And
yeah, I think
I don't know what else to say, to be honest.
No, I think it's like, I think it just comes back to the power of dreaming. Like, I think we're such big dreamers, and we should encourage that to stay alive, and to, you know, we should encourage everyone to be bigger dreamers. And I don't think that's an unrealistic thing to be, because like you said before, I think you said, like, you become what you believe. And I think that's,
what you believe is what you become.
What you believe is what you become. And that intertwines with dreaming, that intertwines with manifesting. Like, it all starts with the dream, and then you got to put it into action, right? And it'll come in due course. It might not be overnight, but it will come. And I think those moments you touched on about, you know, those times where you were in the bathroom and there was, excessive blood everywhere and you were hoping to get that next breath, those are the times that probably breed urgency in your life as well, right? Like these are the things that make us think, fuck, like we're not here forever. Like we don't want to be, existing in life. And this is why we're so urgent to just get out there and chase. And I think that's that urgency that's really, I think, being a key value of mine recently as well. And I think yours too, Ilan. Like, unfortunately, we've experienced some personal death, each of us this year. And I think when you do experience those, death and like tough times and you see it in other people's lives, it really instills that urgency. So I think, I think something that always eats me up is like when this doesn't come from a place of like criticism, but when I see people like kind of being passive in life, it kind of pisses me off because I see so much, like everyone's got such heavy potential. Like everyone can do something so great. And I think it's like, I just wish we could all be as urgent,
It's so true. And, I don't think I'm like special, or I don't think that I have qualities that other people don't possess. I just think that first lesson that you mentioned there before, what you believe is what you become, that my parents taught me the minute they walked out of that doctor's surgery, who told them that my life was going to be nothing, that self-belief that I've fostered over a lifetime of choosing to believe in the positive, choosing to see with optimism what my future could hold, is the one thing that sets apart the people who go on to do things and live lives that feel meaningful and purpose-driven, and the ones that don't. Is if you can first believe it and then find a way to like just back up that belief with action, because I think it's like this self-fulfilling prophecy, like what you believe encourages how you behave, and how you behave really enforces outcomes. And then those outcomes go back and reinforce that initial belief. And so that can be a negative circle or it can be a positive one.
100%.
And man, life's just too short to believe that those good things aren't what you're destined for. And so, man, I'm just charging forward at all the shit that I want. And I'm not going to stop until it's there. And then when I've got it, I'm going to go even harder.
Brad, honestly, I think that is one of the best philosophies you can live by. I think for any of our listeners who may potentially be going through some sort of rut in life, or they've overcome some challenges and they've questioned their own self-worth and they've thought, can I do it? I think your story of resilience, your strength, your courage, I can really reel off some endless compliments, but I mean, there's a lot of value to be taken from your story. And I think this would be a kind of an excellent way for us to wrap up the podcast. We want to know though, what's on for you the next kind of few months?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm really excited for the coming months. I feel really optimistic about the speaking stuff and the opportunities that lay ahead. I've got what I do personally as a keynote speaker, which is essentially I'm a storyteller. I get up on stage, I share stories, a couple of that I've touched on here with you guys tonight, but a whole heap of depth and as emotionally as I do on the podcast. I'm not shy to have a cry on stage, and for me it's so visceral because it's lived experience, so it's got some structure, but a lot of it takes and forms its own life on stage. I've also got a keynote in which I present alongside one of my good mates, Brett Kennellan, who would be an incredible guest for the podcast, might I add. Brett survived a bull shark attack.
Oh.
What a story.
Yeah.
And so we do a joint keynote together, which we're really excited for. There's a bunch of opportunity that we've already been doing that, but we'll be doing more of that back end of this year. I've got the podcast, which is very close to 200 episodes. Maybe by the time this comes out, I'll have ticked off my 200th episode, which is exciting. And I think I've got the next 7 weeks of pods planned.
Unreal.
And
that's organization, mate.
That's great.
For someone that says he's not always organized, that's organization.
I'm organized when it comes to the dream, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And it's very exciting for what lies ahead. I've got a marathon coming up with my partner, Soph. It'll be her first, and another opportunity for me to test myself and prove that I am the man that I say I am. But just more life, lads, like just more adventure and just continuing to dig my heels in and not take no for an answer, to to keep moving towards what I want, to keep moving towards a life that is meaningful and full of purpose. And for me, I hope that leads in new and exciting paths in which I never thought would be a part of my reality. And so I'm just going to put my head down and be aware enough to see the opportunities where they pop up and just keep living life.
Keep living life, mate, and keep cracking on, because you're doing an incredible thing over here. Boy from Gong, and he's changing the world. So keep at it, mate. Keep cracking on. It's been an absolute privilege to have you on, to hear your remarkable story, and just to hear the remarkable person which you are. I feel really moved and blessed, and I'm sure all of our listeners will take plenty away. So I urge everyone to, find you. So where can they find you? I know we have mentioned a lot to talk about. So yeah, we urge everyone to tune into Bradley's podcast, but where can they find you on the socials?
I think the best place is just to come straight to Instagram, which is just Bradley J. Dryburgh. If you're watching the chat, you'll see my name just below my mug.
Good name.
Great name. It's the last name's a bit tricky though, so it's always hard for people to find. But you'll find me on socials, and I can provide you guys with the links and everything for the show notes.
Will.
But I guess Instagram's the hub of it all, and always down for a chat, always down to flick your links to the potty and flick you all the resources that I'm constantly sharing, whether it be with the guests who are far smarter than I am on the podcast, or the people that I come into connection with through the keynote speaking space. And I'm just pretty blessed that I'm always around people who have incredible stories and incredible wisdom to share. And so I get to share a bit of all of that on my socials. So definitely come across and say g'day.
Lovely, mate. Well, thank you. And that we will do. So again, big thanks for joining us on the show. And look forward to many more chats. I mean, it's been an hour and a quarter here, but we're sitting here and we can feel like we're all best mates now, aren't we? So thanks for joining us, mate. And good luck for everything in the coming months.
Thanks so much for having me, lads. And and I will say, I think you should be really proud of what you've created here. I think it's underestimated how impactful conversations like this can be. And that starts with you two guys having the courage to go and create a platform and to have these conversations, and putting the effort in to share those and get them out to people. It's life-changing for some people. I know that I've listened to podcasts over the course of my life that have opened me up to new ideas and new opportunities. And that's a real blessing for people to have. So congratulations to you both. I think you're doing an amazing job to give me the space to come on, to feel comfortable, and to even have a good cry. That was a proper cry. You guys made me feel really comfortable. So you're great at what you do, and should be really proud of the podcast.
Thanks, mate. Likewise.
Thank you, mate. Likewise, as we said. And happy week ahead, and happy Tuesday to all our listeners. Thank you, mate.
Thanks, guys.